people want human connection, but we deny it to them every day by posturing and acting like some professional version of ourselves. It's an old myth. You're supposed to be professional, not personal at work, and it is damaging. It is wrong. It's not productive. Now, I'm not saying you're supposed to be best friends at all. I'm saying you have to be human, approachable, real, and a person.
Thanks for tuning into the Top Down Podcast. My name is Josh Mastel, your host. If you are a leader or you want to be a leader one day, you're not going to want to miss this episode with Dr. Todd Dewett. Todd is a renowned educator, a TEDx speaker, an Inc. magazine top 100 leadership speaker. He spent a career with Anderson Consulting and Ernst & Young, got his PhD from Texas A&M, and now he travels the country working with major organizations, helping them develop their leaders into better leaders. You're not going to want to miss this episode. Let's go. Thanks for tuning into the Top Down Podcast. Again, we have Todd Dewett on the line with us today. Really excited to have him as a guest. Todd, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So you've obviously reading your biography of what you're all involved in. I mean, TEDx speaker, Inc. magazine, top 100 leadership speaker. You're an author. You got another book coming out soon. You were a consultant with some pretty major consulting companies for a long time. And you have an incredible resume. For those that are listening in that don't know who you are, why don't you set the table for us and let us know what you're up to these days and a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, I like to say I'm lucky, probably the luckiest guy you're going to meet in quite a while. I started in big box consulting after an MBA with Anderson and Ernst & Young, fell in love with business, really specifically fell in love with studying people relationships or observing people relationships at work because the observation was pretty obvious. We aren't great at optimizing how we deal with people, and I was intrigued by that. So I ended up going to a PhD, Texas A&M in organizational behavior. Spent 10 years as a professor in Ohio at a school I really miss and enjoyed called Wright State University. And then somehow consulting and publishing research from the ivory tower turned into a career writing and giving speeches full time. So these days I'm writing and traveling around to conferences and corporations, entertaining and educating around leadership related topics.
Awesome. Very, very, very cool. So I'm excited to dig into some of that because, our listeners are leaders themselves. They're founders of companies or sales leaders or even salespeople that aspire to be a leader one day. And I know you have very popular book, The Little Black Book of Leadership. Let's start there. Why don't you talk us through a little bit about the Little Black Book? I know you just came out with a new edition of it recently. Talk us through a little bit of that, and then we can segue from there.
Sure. So it actually started years ago with students when I was in the ivory tower. I spent 10 years teaching MBA students leadership-related courses. And one day I finally had enough guilt over the kind of ridiculous inflated price of textbook for that course. I was a reviewer on that text, I should say, but I still felt bad about how much it cost. And so I said, what if I wrote a little book just for these graduate students containing just the 101, just the takeaway, just the most important things I want them to know as young leaders. And I put that together and self-published it and gave it to them for free, and they enjoyed it. And they started giving it to their colleagues and bosses, and then I had to rewrite it and make it into a serious tome, and it's grown a little bit ever since in popularity because it's a no-nonsense practical guide to the relationship side of what happens at work as a leader.
That's awesome. What's the so let's start with like young leaders. Like if you what's some of the best pieces of advice from what you've learned over your career, seen through everything you've done in your research and the writing of the book and your work in the consulting field? What advice would you have for a young person that's aspiring to be a great leader today?
Well, take off your rosy glasses and get ready to work very hard because, first of all, what gets you there is no longer terribly, terribly relevant. The skill set to be a leader over a bunch of, say, accountants or whatever it might be is very different than just being a great accountant. So it's a new skill set, and it is heavily focused on relationships and communication. So the number one thing I would say is get ready to work harder than you did before you were promoted. Get ready to learn new skills, not just rely on the skills that got you there. And step three, and this is a huge one, you've got to learn to get over yourself and get focused on the people around you because you'll never optimize a team if you don't start caring as much about them as you do yourself.
Love it. Love it. I had someone on the podcast just yesterday literally just gave probably the exact same answer that you did. So I love hearing that. I mean, I think it is such a misnomer that, hey, you've been promoted to a manager. This is probably how it used to be for many years. You've been promoted to a manager, go take over the corner office, shut the door, like you've made it, put your feet up on the desk and start to chill. That's just like that. My days of leading a team, I lead a team now. I mean, I would love to go back into just selling and just being responsible for only myself. That was so much easier.
Difficult compared to what people think, and it can be lonely. You're right.
Totally. So you mentioned two important things in there in that piece of advice that I wanted to kind of dig into. You mentioned there's two things in being a great leader: managing relationships and communication. I'd like to talk about both of those. When you mention the relationship piece of things, where does your mind go?
Well, I mean, one of the first pieces of advice I give to anyone, I say this with respect, is you have to get over yourself. And what happens is that leaders enter new professionals in general enter new relationships, and we often, in a defensive way, which is a fairly human thing to do, lead with our strengths, our accolades, our degrees, our accomplishments, things we know and are good at and have been, applauded for. That's not terribly useful, but at some point that can, excuse me, that can help you build some respect and rapport in a relationship. But generally speaking, you're supposed to be kind, give them a minimum about you, and be inquisitive about them. That always drives better connection, better rapport. So you do have to start by getting over yourself. That's where real conversation begins, when someone else hears that you're invested in listening to them.
Love it. Love it. And what's your take on this? Kind of like a new movement right now, which I think is great. I really like it. It's almost kind of becoming a fad in a way through some publications out there and a lot of books being written on it. But there's the idea of vulnerability in being a leader, I think, which plays a lot in this relationship side of showing your people that you're a human, you're vulnerable, and sharing things that you're concerned about. What's your take on that?
To be honest with you, that is the most important thing in the last 2-3 years I've been focused on. There's a lot of research to back this up as well. People want human connection, but we deny it to them every day by posturing and acting like some professional version of ourselves. It's an old myth. You're supposed to be professional, not personal at work, and it is damaging. It is wrong. It's not productive. Now, I'm not saying you're supposed to be best friends at all. I'm saying you have to be human, approachable, real, and a person just as much as you are a professional. So this idea of vulnerability fits into that paradigm, because most people want you to know about their wins. They never want you to know about their mistakes, their setbacks, their learning moments, their abject failures. So, for example, when I'm on stage talking about this topic, I very often talk about a speech I gave. I won't tell you the whole story, just the punchline. Years ago, maybe 15 plus years ago, when someone first paid me a few thousand to stand on stage and rant like a professional, I was at State Farm, and I failed so bad. It was embarrassing. I really, really thought I knew what I was doing, because I was good in the classroom and good in a training environment. But a keynote was a very different thing. Thought I knew that. I did not, and I failed, and it hurt, and it was a bad day. And it was a day you can make a choice, a big choice, to really change paths and get away from that thing that caused you pain because you don't like it or you don't understand it or something, or choose to look in the mirror, even if it hurts, and learn something and let that failure be a catalyst for something better. That's vulnerability, sharing that story with others. And one of the biggest truths I've seen since I started preaching this to many, many groups over the last few years is that people find a burden lifted when they can start talking about the fact that, yes, they've got many accolades, but you know what? To get there were bruises, there were bumps, and there were screw-ups, and those are every bit as important as anything else if you actually value learning. So for many people, just talking about those learning moments is a terribly vulnerable thing. So part of what I do is try to give them permission to do that, because when one person does it, it tends to spread.
Love that. Love that. Now, I can't let you tease us with that story and not share a little bit more, because we've all had our embarrassing moments on stage or in front of a group. What was the epic failure at State Farm?
Well, I mean, the truth is being in the classroom for an MBA is one type of communication, and it's not very story-based or fun like you think of a good keynote. So anyhow, I was trying to start some side efforts. I was doing a little speaking and training and consulting, and I had my first website, my first book out, things of that nature. And I had done local events, and that's kind of where I was. But you always, of course, online, put forth your best picture of you and act like you're a little more than you really are. And I was doing that, and it lured in my first big client, like I said, maybe 15 years ago. It was a big senior vice president of something from State Farm. Hey, man, got on the phone. I got your book, saw the website. We've got this big old event coming up, 500 plus senior managers. We think you're the guy. Let's talk about it. And I was a rookie, acting like I was a somebody as a speaker anyway. And he said, well, here's the topic. We went through the whole topic. And it was a really fun conversation, but I was such a rookie. I didn't even talk about speaking fees. Finally, the client guy says, well, look, I think we're going to book you. This is great. But look, we can't pay you more than, and he threw out a number. That number was bigger than any number I'd ever seen before. And he said, well, live with that. And I said, well, I'll try.
I'll make it work.
I'll make it work, man. And I went to the gig later. And I walked in, and it was very exciting. Big ballroom. Never been in a ballroom that big at that time as a speaker. Big stage, lots of lights, cameras, senior leaders, blue chip firm, big fee. This is a first on many levels, and I was really kind of thrilled more than anything else. And I sat down with a bunch of executives who treated me like somebody, and they gave me a flowery introduction at the mic like nobody's business. And everyone, for no reason, which still amuses me to this day as a speaker, claps, though you've done nothing for them as you take the stage. And I stood there looking at 500 people, very excited. And I realized this is probably my favorite professional day to date. And then I opened my mouth and everything started to go wrong. Immediately, I began to pontificate with 4-syllable words that no one understood, like a horrible, overrated professor would in a classroom. And it didn't take a genius to know that in about 3 minutes, I had violated every presentation rule that I now know you're not supposed to violate. I had slides that were dense that no one could read. I was using quotes of research and theory that were just obtuse and not appropriate for a keynote, and the entire audience of 500 senior leaders completely and utterly tuned out, talked to their neighbor, did anything other than listen to my bloviating self. So I looked at my watch. No, it's true. It's true. I'll never forget this, and it's visceral looking at it, and that's why I like to write about it and talk about it, because it helps people realize they've been through these things too. So I'm standing on stage. I'm crashing badly. And I look at my watch. I've got 50 minutes to go. And I have absolutely no idea how to make this any better. So I continued being not so useful at all. When I was done, they gave me an insincere golf clap like nobody's business. And I left quickly with no networking at all, after they handed me a check that I did not earn, and an executive handed it to me, and he said, thank you. And I don't think he meant it. And I felt very guilty, to be honest with you. Now, driving home, I felt maybe 3 inches tall. It was a 3-hour trip to Chicago from where I was living. That's where the speech was. And I really flashed back after about 20 minutes of feeling sorry for myself and being angry at the audience for not understanding me.
Oh, no.
The audience really was my focus, which is a human thing. If something goes wrong, we blame others. The question is how quickly you get over that, as to whether or not you're going to improve quickly. I'm thinking about that bad audience. I flash back to something Mom said years ago. Great advice. She'd seen me lose a high school basketball game and get a very long face as a result, sitting at home later. Excuse me. And she saw me, and she looked at me and said something that many moms have said. She said, you're having a pity party, aren't you? I said, yes, ma'am. I guess so. She said, look, everyone gets there. The question is what you do about it, as to whether or not you're going to really step forward and grow a little bit. Here's my advice, kid. You should give yourself a deadline. Measure it in hours, not days or weeks. And when that deadline hits, you're going to stand up mentally, stop feeling sorry for yourself, stop blaming, and choose to go learn something so you don't face this situation in the future. Again, that's great advice. I mean, any way you slice it, it's just great advice. I use it time and again. I'm driving home. I remembered that advice, and I started thinking about it, and I realized quickly, long story short, that I live in a world that has the internet, and I decided to go out and find videos of the greatest speakers, men, women, old, young, politics, business, religion, you name it. And I sat like a good scholar and took notes as I watched them. And every single gig, stage after stage, I got a little better and a little better. I watched video of the greats. I watched video of me. Then I cried. And then I kept taking notes and getting better. And you fast forward about 15 years, and I got to do this for, well, embarrassingly good numbers all over planet Earth. And there's a lot of reasons that's true. There's only one best reason, and that's because I was lucky enough to fall on my face in front of 500 senior leaders at State Farm and choose, because everything in life's a choice, to choose to make that a catalyzing event instead of something I'd hide in the back of my head.
That's a great story. And what I take from that is, you know, as I look back to some of the most, I think, critical conversations I've had with like some employees or some people that I was maybe trying to help out, or even people that helped me out, I feel like stories of hey, I see you, maybe you messed something up. Hey, I've been there. Listen to the story of how I messed something up before, can help people learn more so than, hey, look how good I used to be. So that kind of really ties back into your point about relationships earlier. That's really good.
You got it.
I got a question about academia for you. So I'm really, and you come from that world. I know you taught in higher education for a while. I am really passionate about the, younger generation. I'm, a millennial myself, but like the generation of people coming out of college, entering into the workforce. And the reason is I spent most of my life as a professional hiring those people. So I've interviewed thousands of young people right out of college, hired many of them. And I've seen a theme that I'd like to get your take on, being in the higher education space. I feel like the universities have a responsibility in leadership of preparing people for the real world. And I don't think they do a great job of it from my angle of what I've seen through hiring young people out of school. What's your take on that on the other side of the fence?
Well, I agree completely. There's lots of reasons I left the ivory tower for entrepreneurial role that I have now. One of them, because I agree with you. So I'll just pick on the business school as one example. If you go back 100 years on college campuses, those that had business schools, they were not full of PhDs. They were full of practitioners and former executives and things of that nature who were not academic, but they were extremely practical and experienced. They took a lot of guff from the classic academicians on university campuses for not having academic credentials, not being scientists of some sort. And so slowly we started to get into that game. Now, people like me, by the time I came around, we went to good schools and we're very well trained social scientists by the time we were done. We understand how to produce research, et cetera, et cetera. What we lost in the process of creating great scientists is all of that practical stuff that many people like you lament, because as a person who had a foot in industry and a foot in ivory tower the whole time I was there, never losing track of advising, consulting, speaking, training, and so on, I can tell you that the average business school prof is not deeply ingrained in the business community. They're not skilled. They don't have that skill set. Thus, they can't share it with their students because they are very preoccupied, and this is how they're judged, as scientists who need to produce research, which is wonderful, by the way, but we've simply begun to neglect the practical preparation that we probably should give kids. You're right.
Yeah. All right, good. I just want to make sure I wasn't crazy on that. And I think it's, what's the plan? Do you see that changing ever? Do you think colleges are going to be faced with a major problem when students start to realize that maybe it's not the best way to prepare themselves for the real world? Like, what's going to happen?
Yeah, we're actually, the wave is crashing. We're right in the middle of, some say, a revolution to address the issue that you've brought up. And it was kickstarted hard by the trend we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years of people who have degrees in hand and no job and no prospects of getting a job. We have created a massive oversupply, and jobs are not there to meet it. Oversupply of degrees. So people are in debt in horrible ways and don't know what to do about it, even though they were kind of promised a bright future if they got the degree. What's happening is that schools are closing. Lots of smaller and private schools are closing because students don't see the value in it anymore, so their numbers are down. And there is a push to become more practical, to get students that thing they need for a career, not just for intellectual attainment. For example, in the business school, they don't just use, at better business schools, classically trained social scientists anymore in accounting, marketing, management, et cetera. They also have a new cadre of what they call clinical professors. They have different names. That's the most common one, who sometimes are degreed, sometimes are not, have small, not large research requirements, but have lots of practical duties, such as running centers and helping kids find jobs and other practical things. So slowly but surely, it's happening. Now, I don't know if it's too late to save that paradigm or not. I mean, one huge part of my career is making educational courses for the world's largest platform, LinkedIn Learning, which I love. And that's simple, beautiful 24/7 video access to almost any topic you can imagine. Universities are having a tough time competing with the online explosion of options.
Totally. Well, I've checked out some of those LinkedIn courses that you run. And any of the listeners here, I'll tag that below this episode so you can go check that out. But you're doing some really good stuff over there. That's awesome.
Thanks, man.
So I'd like to hear some stories from you on, like, you're passionate about leadership. You worked for some amazing companies, which I'm assuming is where some of this passion started. But there has to be like a leader or two in your past that had such an impact on you that you're like, I really like this idea of how people could be a good leader, good leaders. Who's the best leader you ever worked for, and why?
The best I ever worked for and why? Well, probably, believe it or not, he was an academician. A gentleman named Bud Baker, who's still not quite retired. He's a professor at a little school called Wright State University. Had a military background. He's a full bird colonel, and he was a serious consumer of what it means to be a great leader. He read all the classics like some people who get obsessed do, and he tried to practice them when he was a department chair and a dean. And I found it extremely inspirational that he tried to consume good information. He tried to learn from the greats that were around him or throughout his career and then translate it into something practical. And I think the reason he stuck with me as a guy worth listening to is because he had a positivity in his approach to difficult challenges we all face at work that really blew me away. That's one of the key themes when you ask me about leaders that made an impression. I think about him on the positive side, but what's easier for me to say is I remember so many bad bosses and stories that have been shared with me,
Sure.
thousands of bad bosses who really do have some expertise and have really just no understanding of how to care about people or communicate about people. I mean, if I could share with you stories, I would actually share stories about the toxic environments that are far more common than most people might realize. It's not 1 in 10 bosses who are lacking in skills to the point of causing negative emotions in employees. It's probably closer to 5 or 6 out of 10, even though I'm not sure I've seen good research on that specific question. I mean, I can tell you about the time a former student, MBA student, called me. Hey, we got to have lunch. I need some coaching. Okay, great. I met this woman, lovely person, good student, works for an investment firm. And she started telling me about her boss, who I knew in this community that we lived in. And he had an issue, not just with her, and I knew this because I knew more people involved, but he had an issue with females in leadership positions, which is a dinosaur view that's still around and dying quickly, as you know. And he did not stop, keep those thoughts to himself. He shared them loudly with other people listening, with her. The result is fascinating and terrible. This is the power of a leader. A leader can lift you up and make you truly believe that more is possible. Dreams are not just cliches. They are things to be chased, and let's talk about that. Or they could do what they did to this woman and had her every single day, she said, for months, reduced to tears in her car. She had to race to her car to keep the tears in before she got there. And then every morning she found herself circling around the vicinity of the building, feeling difficult to actually park and voluntarily walk in to that situation. And she was worried about her health deteriorating. I told her she should be worried. And I'm here to tell you, I've heard hundreds of those stories.
Yeah, you hear more. You're right. I'd like to, if they could try to find some statistical analysis on it. But you're right. I bet there is way more bad than good out there, which is it's such a shame. Such a shame.
It's a total shame. I mean, it gives me a career. I make that joke all the time. Hey, thanks.
Sure.
It gives me a career, something to talk about.
Yeah.
But it is really sad. The good news, you're talking about yourself as a millennial and young people out there. The good news is that there are interesting value differences across the generational divides, and we're facing this silver tsunami whereby in the next 20, we're going to see millions and millions of gray hairs retire, and folks your age and younger taking over at positions, at levels, at proportions we've never seen before. Younger people, women, and minorities, according to all the experts, are going to be taking over in the next 20 in numbers never before even imagined. And that's fascinating and amazing if you figure out how to harness it as you go through that labor transition. But one of the upsides is what you're talking about in terms of the power of leadership, because the younger generations tend to value family, leisure, purpose beyond a paycheck, and other high-minded notions that I personally love more than the older generation. So I think that's quite hopeful.
Yeah, that's great. That is really great. Hey, you mentioned earlier, you brought up the military aspect from the boss that you worked for, and I wanted to hit on that really quick because it touches home for me because I have my dad was in the military for 30 years, raised by him. I mean, like I learned almost everything I know from my dad being very like you make your bed in the morning, you shine your shoes. Like all my discipline in life comes from that. But there's an interesting contradiction in a way that, to me, I think the U.S. military is looked at as producing amazing leaders, and their leadership is excellent. Like there's just a lot written about that. But when I think about military style leadership, I don't think about the vulnerable building relationship type leadership that you're talking about. What am I missing? Like what's the difference and why does it work?
No, it's a unique thing in and of itself, and it works in a unique environment called the military.
Sure.
And the same exact thing that makes a leader. And I'm not anti-military. I think it's fascinating, interesting. We need it, and that's a whole separate conversation. But if the average, I would hypothesize the average leader that is very successful in the military environment would have work to do, maybe a good bit of work to do to adjust and grow their understanding of optimizing, a workforce if they were to go to the private sector. I bet you my friend Bud would say the same thing. I'm not sure we ever had that conversation. So what they get is a lot of thoughts about using resources, the logistics of teams and organizations. They get a lot of the logistical, deep mechanical side of leadership drilled into them. They don't go into the psych side as much on these things we've been talking about. Again, I'm no expert on military leadership training, by the way, but I did have a ton of them. Wright State was right next to Wright Pat Air Force Base, and so I had a quarter of every class that were in the military or enlisted or something. It's different. It is different because command and control, which makes people successful in the military, is increasingly not at all the model that works in industry. So you might say there is a ongoing bifurcation between the models that work in that one environment, military, and the emerging best case scenario for management in private industry, which increasingly is about camaraderie, collaboration. We're all in this together. Leaders that know how to empathize with others as much as they know how to dictate when needed, etc.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't think of it that way. That's really good. So when you're traveling around speaking and doing consulting into corporate America, like what are some of the themes that you're seeing of like typical the more common things you're fixing or having to coach people around fixing? What are some of those?
They're amazingly similar. I mean, most people I meet them, they've got some depth of expertise in whatever it might be, whether it's oil and gas or an engineering field or something. I'm the opposite. I'm a world-class generalist. I have seen teams at different managerial levels across so many industries, and that affords me the ability to answer your question by saying, man, it's so similar across vocations and industries how people get people wrong. For example, managers often radically over-assume how their employees are thinking, feeling, and thus underinvest in conversation that might lead to coaching or feedback that is needed. I'll give you one example that stuck with me over the years, and I've seen many versions of this. I was consulting with some firm and trying to coach and develop their management team, which was a group of around 50 people. And this one manager says to me, and he was one of the younger people, and he was kind of seemed happy I was there. And he said, "Yeah, I'm glad you're here. I think this makes sense. But I got to tell you, me and the team I lead, which is about 7, 8 guys, we're close. We understand each other. There's no real issues there. But I understand we got to do these survey work, and I'll make sure they'll fill it out for you and such." So when I got the feedback from his group, they were almost incensed, not just a topic on their radar. They were almost incensed that this will sound strange to you, but every Monday he didn't say, "Hey, how you doing? How was your weekend? How's the family?" Every Friday he didn't say, "Amazing contribution this week. Thanks, guys. Enjoy your weekend." He never did either of those things in any significant way. And to him, number one, that didn't sound immediately hugely relevant. And and two, he couldn't believe that's what they cared about, right? Why aren't they cared about sales numbers or other things he wanted to talk about? And I said, well, welcome to the paradigm shift that you didn't know that you have to face, because what you think about and care about is different than what they think about and care about. You got to find the overlap, and you got to figure out how to show some love for their part that doesn't overlap with yours if you ever want them to care about your part that doesn't overlap as well. Does that make sense?
100%. That's great.
Tough lesson for a lot of leaders.
Anything, have you seen anything that's kind of out of the norm that's working extremely well? Like when you first saw it, you're like, wait, you're doing it how? What are you doing? But like it brilliantly is working. Anything kind of crazy like that?
Well, kind of. I mean, one thing that's I'm very, very interested in lately is emerging trends against some old dinosaur policies and procedures that don't work. I can think of one, which is you got to have a college degree. Ernst & Young in certain parts of the world, but Microsoft in certain parts, LinkedIn in certain parts are no longer requiring it. They're looking for experience and not just saying no to people if they don't have a college degree. I think it's beautiful for a million reasons. So that's a radical trend that's starting to gain some attention. Here's another one that's a little closer to my home. I had some success with once. We are starting to recognize that even though we're supposed to invest in people, which does probably mean doing some employee evaluations, that the way we've done them, I mean almost everywhere, is pretty unproductive, if not sometimes horribly unproductive. It tends to be driven for a mid-size or a large firm by an onerous, time-consuming piece of software that no one has ever loved or felt motivated by ever.
Yeah.
And yet the goal of that system is to do that. And so one of the trends is to streamline and or get rid of the old school approach to employee evaluations that is overbearing and full of ratings that aren't worth a darn, administered by managers who don't have keen insight into certain employees they're evaluating anyway. And in place, we're seeing two things. One is more streamlined small systems so it doesn't become such a time suck so people don't hate it. They might actually listen to the data that they receive. And number two, and this is my favorite part, some of that time we used to overinvest in those bloated eval systems should be invested in creating new conversations, new one-on-ones where people learn to have conversations and get past posturing, because I can promise you this, no formal, infrequent conversation, which is what an eval is, ever produces greater data than a frequent informal conversation between an employee and their boss.
That's really cool. Yeah, I've always had a bone to pick with, I come from smaller mid-sized companies where this wasn't super common, but it blew my mind when I heard that, large companies will do, twice a year or once a year employee evaluations. I'm like, if you see me doing something wrong and you wait 9 months to tell me, I'm going to be pissed off. It's crazy that corporate America runs that way. It blows my mind.
The bigger the firm, the more likely the absurdities are to show up.
Sure. Well, hey, this was really awesome. I think the biggest takeaway for me from our conversation is get over yourself as a leader. I think that's probably a good title for this one. Vulnerability, relationships, communication, tons of great insight here. I really appreciate your time. If anybody listening to this wants to find you, where should we point folks? Where can folks engage with you at?
My home on the web, drdewett.com. That's DRDEWETT.com.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, Todd, thanks so much again. Appreciate the time. I'm looking forward to continuing this chat down the road.
Thanks, man. Take care.
All right. If you're listening to the podcast still at the end, you're one of our heroes that's lasted the entire time. Thank you so much. Do us a favor. Share this with someone that you think would get some value out of this. Tag us on it on social media and continue to listen on for our next episode. Thanks a lot.